Good afternoon, everyone. I am Parsa Sajid. Welcome to Cambridge, and welcome to the 11th Annual International Development Conference, Turning the Tide Against Poverty, Partnerships for Change. International development, and in that, the issue of poverty reduction is a complex area, one that requires a multi-angled approach. Through our 4 keynote speeches, 16 panels, and 4 workshops, we hope to highlight issues ranging from public-private partnerships in HIV/AIDS, the role of microfinance in conflict areas, to rights-based development in Afghanistan. Together, we can make this gathering a truly meaningful learning experience for all. We welcome you to 3 days of exciting discussions and look forward to the inspiring exchange of ideas, come up with new solutions, and try to focus on poverty reduction from a fresh perspective. I would like to thank the other conference co-chairs, Zaida Shai, and our very dedicated organizing team, who has so diligently worked for the last 7 months to make this conference a success. Thank you also to our sponsors, advisors, and the wonderful team of volunteers, all of whom have so graciously and generously helped us with the conference. We are honored to have Honorable Ashraf Qazi, the Special UN Envoy to Iraq, as our opening keynote speaker. We are also honored to have Professor Michael Ignatieff, the Carr Professor of Human Rights Policy and Director of the Carr Center of Human Rights, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. Professor Ignatieff is a prolific writer and has written extensively on human rights policy. His major publications include Blood and Belonging, Journeys into New Nationalism, The Lesser Evil, Political Ethics in an Age of Terror, and Human Rights as Politics and Idolatry. Once again, welcome to the International Development Conference, and now I leave you with Professor Michael Ignatieff.
Thank you, Parsa. Welcome to the conference. Welcome to our forum. The subject is which comes first in Iraq, security or development? We meet at a very important time. We're all aware that an election has occurred in Iraq. We're all aware that a president has been chosen, Jalal Talabani of the Kurdish people. We know that a prime minister is going to be was selected yesterday. We know, in other words, that we're living through a crucial period in the political history of a country that has suffered enormously and now just may, be on the road to a democratic stabilization. The UN has been part of this process from the beginning, and that's the second context in which this discussion is important. The democratization of Iraq is one context. The other context is the tremendous pressure on the UN as an institution. Tremendous criticism of the UN in the United States and around the world, but particularly in the United States. Some of it tendentiously ideological, some of it unfortunately rooted in errors of management in the UN itself. And so bring these two facts together, Iraq democratizing and the UN struggling to establish its leadership and its credibility, gives this afternoon a special saliency and importance. The UN's history in Iraq, you know, is a tragic and difficult one. The UN Oil for Food program has proven to be one of the graveyards of the UN's reputation. Although, let's also be clear and be fair, the program fed an awful lot of people and kept a lot of people from malnutrition and hunger over 8 or 9 years. So the management failures cannot lead us to forget the positive good that the program did. It is also the place where one of the UN's most brilliant servants, Sergio Vieira de Mello, was killed, brutally murdered by this insurgency. Not just Sergio, but other people much loved at the Kennedy School, much respected at the Kennedy School. There were 21 people who died in that attack. And so the UN has paid a tremendous price for its commitment to Iraq, and we need to, as we go forward, remember those facts. That's the context of this discussion today. We have a very, very distinguished man to talk to us. He was Pakistan's ambassador to the United States after 2002. He was Pakistan's High Commissioner to India between 1997 and 2002. Going back, he was Pakistan's ambassador to China, to Russia, to East Germany, to Syria. I mean, that's basically says to you, he did every senior job in the Pakistani Foreign Service. He doesn't get more important than that. And just when he'd gone into a distinguished retirement, he was persuaded to come out and take what has to be the toughest job in the UN's portfolio of difficult jobs. That is the United Nations Special Representative to Iraq. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ashraf Kazi, who will talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll be pleased to take questions, which I will administer. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Professor Ignatieff, Parsa, dear friends, including my daughter, whom I'm meeting for the first time since I've come back to the United States. It's an honor and a pleasure, privilege to be here at this podium, in this distinguished forum. The last time I was here, I was assisting my president, who was addressing the Kennedy School of Government in exactly the same place. So I really do feel privileged beyond my just deserts in having been invited to speak to you on a subject of very considerable importance, development or security, which comes first. And I think right at the outset, one can sort of try and dispose of the question with a very trite answer, which is that they're both necessary because they feed into each other. You might say one might have a short-term, immediate priority, but even for security to develop any stability or to take root, many other things will have to happen, particularly on the development front, because over the past several decades, Iraq, which has been blessed by its resources, particularly its mineral resources, oil resources, but in addition to it, Iraq has been just about the only Arab country which has had oil and agriculture, oil and water. But the agriculture sector has faded for a number of reasons in Iraq, mainly because of the subsidy system, and it was easier to sort of feed people through subsidies. Infrastructure was neglected, and then under the sanctions regime, not only the agricultural infrastructure, but throughout the country, that was affected. So you've had over the last 10 or more years, development in reverse going on in Iraq. I was looking at the human development indices in my notes before coming here, and I see that over 10 years from 91 to 2001, Iraq slipped 51 places from 73rd on that list to 120, or from 76 to 127. So it really has been a traumatic experience for the Iraqi people, and a whole middle class has been rendered poor. So you have a whole country in trauma. Unfortunately, such situations exist elsewhere too, but this is a country which had seen good times, even under a government that was a dictatorship, where misgovernance was pretty much the rule. And nonetheless, the resources were sufficient to invest in social and human infrastructure to the extent that Iraq was actually a middle-income country with social indices well above the MENA average, at the Middle East North African average. And today, almost without exception, the social and economic indices of Iraq are well below the MENA average. So that sort of measures what's happened in Iraq. It's people have en masse become impoverished. A threat was sort of made more than a decade ago that they would be sort of sent back to the Stone Age. Well, they might not have gone back to the Stone Age, but that threat has not turned out to be an empty threat. And that has also informed attitudes. Because of the centralized political system, there's a lot of dependency too in Iraq. 60% of the people depend on the PDS, the public distribution system, for food supplies. And oil, fuel is available at something like 5 cents a gallon. And of course, that means it's not available to the people because it's bought at source by powerful gangs, exported abroad at international prices. So there are, in a country which should have fuel available to the people, there are fuel shortages of quite an extraordinary extent. That's very much apart from the fact that the oil infrastructure has been hugely damaged. So when you look at what it will take to restore the physical infrastructure alone in Iraq, it's going to cost something upwards of $50 billion. I mean, you know, and these are initial estimates. You know. Even when things normalize and investment comes into Iraq, it's going to take a long time before Iraq gets back to being the kind of country it was maybe 20 years ago in economic terms, in per capita terms. So it's a huge challenge. And it should be, and poverty reduction, of course, should be within this strategy of trying to normalize Iraq's economy should be a priority, because the numbers of Iraqis who are in absolute poverty, you know, whatever the criteria, $1 a day, or those who are hovering about this category of absolute poverty. Those who are in it and those who are hovering about it add up to something like 25 to 30% of the population, and this proportion is growing all the time. Now, one of the reasons why it's growing is because of security. On paper, there are lots of projects, lots of monies have been allocated. We in the United States, we in the United Nations, forgive the Freudian slip. We have a program to assist Iraq, not only in its political transition, but also with respect to reconstruction and humanitarian development. And we've done a lot of good work within the scale that the UN operates, which is much less than what bilateral donors or major bilateral donors have to offer. But we are circumscribed, just like everybody is, by the security situation. And you see in the resolution 1546, all the commitments we make are caveated by the phrase circumstances permitting. And circumstances permitting means security permitting. And as Professor Ignatieff sort of mentioned, my predecessor was killed along with 21 of his colleagues. And therefore it's not surprising that we are extremely security conscious. But despite the fact that the security situation has for the past 18 months either been stable or deteriorating, we've gone into Iraq because we've seen it to be extremely important for the international staff of the United Nations to return to Baghdad. In a sense, UNAMI, that is the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, did not leave Iraq even after the tragedy of August the 19th. Those who left were the international staff, and they were relocated in neighboring countries, Jordan and Kuwait. The national staff remained there, and the international staff continued to operate within Iraq through NGOs and through agencies and domestic partners, and managed to make its contribution to a number of projects through the cluster system which had been developed in Amman, whereby agencies would get together and join up with lead ministries and cooperate with other ministries and UN agencies to sort of build up capacity amongst the ministries and sort of contribute to the delivery of basic services, like sanitation and water purification and community development programs. But our visibility wasn't very much, and therefore the Iraqis felt that the UN wasn't really there, even when we were there. And this is true even with respect to the electoral process. We were critically important with respect to the establishment of the Election Commission, which conducted the elections. We didn't conduct the elections ourselves, but we set up the body. But we had few people on the ground, and we were in the international zone, and we couldn't operate outside the international zone because of the security situation. So although it wouldn't be immodest of me, it would be accurate to say that without the assistance we gave the Election Commission might not have been in a position to conduct the elections in the fine manner it did conduct those elections. Nonetheless, most of the Iraqis were not aware or hugely aware, except those we interacted with, or the election commissioners themselves, of the presence of the United Nations there. And they used to compare numbers. We were about 50 odd in Iraq, including people from bilateral countries who had provided experts under our supervision, and they compared this number with the 250 or so who were available for the Afghan election. But the Afghan election was being directly conducted by the United Nations, which was not the case in Iraq. We have plans now to step up our cooperation, and we will be playing a very important role in coordinating assistance between donor countries and the incoming government. And we hope to sort of increase our physical presence despite the fact that the security conditions remain challenging. Now, it is true that development, even though it's a priority, it is going to be hugely constrained by security. So it is important. It is, you might even say, the number one priority to bring about an improvement in the security situation for anything to happen, for development to happen, for the political transition process to reach its conclusion by the end of this year, hopefully in the form of a constitutional, democratically elected government. So the security situation is number one. But the security situation can't be approached through a single dimension approach. It is critical to develop the capabilities of the law and order or law enforcement departments of the government, the Ministry of Interior, the security forces, the Ministry of Defense, and all of those are absolutely important. But unless you combine those with other measures, including development activities, and just as important, the political outreach, which is necessary to ensure that the next phase of the transition process is even more inclusive than was the electoral phase, or the elections which we recently had, because the elections which we had were successful in the sense that the overall turnout was very high, and the turnout in the north and the south was even more impressive, and the number of incidents and casualties in relation to the scale of the exercise were very few, and the Iraqi security forces performed extremely well. Nonetheless, it is a fact that a major segment of the Iraqi polity or political society did not participate significantly in the elections. And this is sort of brought out by the fact that participation figures ranged from 89 to 90% in certain parts of Kurdistan to 2% in Anbar, which is a wholly, or practically almost wholly, Arab Sunni province. So that sort of defines the problem that the current phase in the in the political transition process will be confronted with, and that is the constitution-making phase. So you have a National Assembly which is elected but not entirely representative of all the political forces that make up the polity of Iraq. But it is a good augury that the leaders of the government that is being formed right now, because it's in the process of completing its formation, but we have a prime minister and the president, and they were very assiduous in reaching out to those elements amongst the Arab Sunnis who did not participate in the elections in order to bring them into the government, and later on they intend to bring them into the constitution-making process, because unless the constitution-making process is even more inclusive than the electoral process, it could run the risk of rejection at the referendum stage. The text of this constitution is scheduled to be completed by August the 15th. There is the possibility of a 6-month extension under the interim constitution called TAL, but we should all hope that the deadline of August the 15th can be met so that the process isn't delayed. Otherwise, this delay could feed in, and the next phase could also be delayed. And the referendum is scheduled for October, and then if it's approved, the constitutional election would be held in December. Now, if the constitution-making process is not sufficiently inclusive, and you have a text which is not acceptable to a significant segment of the Iraqi population, it runs the risk of being rejected by 3 governorates, in which case the constitution would stand rejected. And the whole political process would then have to begin from the beginning, including an election, because the National Assembly would be dissolved. Now, this is the context within which development has to be addressed. So we've had a provisional government, we've had an interim government, and now we have a transitional government. And even this government will reach its end in December, when it will be replaced by a permanent government elected under an approved constitution. So development is a priority that everybody accepts, but they are preoccupied with the immediate. And the immediate has been, as we've seen, A, the elections, and B, the government formation, and C, the security challenges. And these security challenges will need to be addressed, as I said, not simply by security measures, but also by complementary measures in the political field. And only then will we be able to bring about the kind of context in which we'll be able to move away from emergency and relief measures to genuine development measures which require longer-term investments in infrastructure. And Iraq, because as I said before, the degree of destruction of the productive base in the Iraqi economy has been of such an extent that vast amounts will be required. When peace comes there, given the essential underlying mineral wealth of Iraq, and the fact that it has large numbers of very talented and technically qualified people, I believe it will be successful in attracting the required investments. But when is that going to begin happening in a big way? That'll only, I believe, begin to happen in a big way if the political transition stays on course and is successfully completed, or at least the present phase envisaged by Resolution 1546 is completed by December of this year, or if they avail of an extension, it could be 6 months later. But let us all resolve, as the international community and the United Nations is resolved to assist in the successful transition process, because otherwise a context for development activities will simply not be there. So it is an integrated process that will be required, and an inclusive process, and ultimately it's going to have to be an Iraqi-driven and Iraqi-owned process. They need assistance, they welcome assistance, they see the UN as an organization which can coordinate assistance, but they are, like people of any other country, very sensitive about their sovereign independence, and one has to take care not to unwittingly give them a sense of being intruded upon. Because right now in this constitution-making process, people have the best intentions of the world. They want to see Iraq move in one direction or another direction for the good of Iraq, for the good of its people. But you have a parliament where the discussions will be free and will be covered by the media, and there will be people who will criticize and say, this is happening because there are external agendas and things of that sort. So one has to be that much more sensitive about how the Iraqis perceive things. We have been in touch with them with respect to the constitutional phase, and most of the leaders, in fact, I can't think of anyone who has not welcomed the UN and also welcomed donors playing an important role in assisting them. At the same time, almost all of them enter caveats saying that this is a sovereign Iraqi process, the making of a constitution, even more than the electoral process was, because our interlocutor for the electoral process was the Election Commission. Our interlocutor here will be the Parliament of Iraq, and there's nothing more sovereign than that. So having said that, I think we can look, the best case scenario, which has got a reasonable probability of happening, is that the constitutional process will be a nationwide dialogue, an inclusive process, a participatory process in which people through various forums will discuss, debate the various aspects and the various issues that will come up during the constitution-making process. And if that happens, then you might have the emergence of a political culture of peace, of dialogue, of mutual accommodation, which is going to be the very best, this kind of culture or environment for the development process. Because up until now, there has been a reversion in Iraq because of the pressures because of its experience of the past 20 years, wars and sanctions and dislocation on a vast scale. The politics of Iraq had reverted to identity-based politics. People revert back to, those shelters, and negotiate from those shelters with each other, and the levels of mutual mistrust have been very high. That has to be addressed. In that sense, the state has to be, in a sense, rebuilt so that those levels of mutual trust can rise to the point where constructive, fruitful dialogue becomes possible. And the UN is mandated to promote dialogue and promote compromise and promote discussion of issues on which differences are deep. Happily, we've seen in the government formation process that people with different ideas, with reservations, have engaged with each other, have reached understandings to the extent that a government has been formed, even if it's taken a little longer than most people anticipated. That's not too surprising, because after all, Iraq hasn't had such an experience in its recent or even in its entire history. And the fact that it's taken over 2 months, I don't think of itself means very much, except that it's eaten into the time available to draft the constitution. But I'm sure that's something that can be addressed. We now have a government that has emerged from an election and an intensive negotiating process, and it is going to be, and what's more, it has included elements from the community which did not participate in the elections. There was a recognition that whatever the reasons were for their staying away from the elections, their participation is essential. And hopefully that will give or reduce the sense of alienation or discrimination that was fairly widespread amongst the Arab Sunni population. There are many, many challenges ahead in Iraq. They will have to maintain the same degree of a sense of negotiating differences within known parameters, that it's in nobody's interest to push the envelope beyond the edge of the negotiating table, because in that case, everybody loses. And I think that sense is there. It's no guarantee that elections will succeed, but that sense is there, and the international community needs to be as responsive and as helpful as is possible to encourage the Iraqis to continue with this process and to bring about a context in which development, which is the very condition for Iraq recovering the standard of living that it had 20 years ago, because it's been de-developing for the last 20 years. Development here now is going to be a recovery process, and that will require a context of increasing stability, increasing hope. Some trends are very encouraging. The number of incidents security-related incidents have been on the decline, but hopefully this trend will become stable when we see progress on other fronts. Any movement on a single front is an uncertain movement, but when we have an integrated movement along a broad range of fronts, we can then hope that the situation is really taking a turn or turning the corner for the better. Well, thank you for the...
I do a lot of public speaking, and what I noticed that you can't see is that he did the entire thing without a note, which is very impressive. So thank you. We're going to go to questions, and so you got to get back up on your feet, Ambassador. We're going to work you here. Let me, while we've got the format for questions is that there is a microphone here, there's a microphone there, there's a microphone there, and there's a microphone there. If you please queue up, that's how we're going to do it. And while you do that, I'm going to ask the first question. One of the things that we emphasize a lot at the Kennedy School about development is the necessity of institutions. And we put a lot of emphasis on the crucial role of state institutions in providing the frame, the regulatory framework, the administrative framework, the rule of law framework necessary for development. What's your assessment, and what's the assessment of your UN teams about the level of capacity of the Iraqi state? I ask this because when the Americans went into Iraq, I think there was the assumption that the state would remain and the Ba'athist Party would disappear, and what appears to have happened is that the state collapsed. I'm just wondering how you could assess the existing state infrastructure of Iraq and its potential as a development engine or a development instrument as you go forward.
Well, state institutions have been degraded even in their abilities to deliver services. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And this has been exacerbated enormously because of the recent war, because of the experience of Iraq even before that. There was the first Gulf War, there was the Iran-Iraq War, there was the sanctions, and then under the dictatorship where the constitution also legalized one man, it became a presidential constitution, and also institutions were being overshadowed even before all of these devastating developments shattered social life in general and state life. So one of the experiences of NGOs and UN agencies and others seeking to assist Iraq is the absolute priority need to build up capacity amongst the various ministries and to build up coordinating capacity. And one of the priorities that we will have with the new government is to work with it in order to encourage it to develop a focal point for the coordination of assistance, which will be on offer to Iraq so that it is effectively utilized. And we have been working in this field, and others have been working in this field too. But you're absolutely right to point out this is a major challenge. It has to be addressed, and the Iraqis themselves, or the ministers and the officials, are very, very aware of this. They need to get out of the dependency syndrome, which had developed also because it was a highly subsidized economy. Food and fuel, as I mentioned, the price of fuel, is ludicrous, as a result of which it wasn't even available. So those things will have to be addressed.
Let's go to the first question here, and the ground rules at the forum are: you got to identify yourself, and then you ask a question, and a question is a very short interrogative statement that ends in a question mark. And it's sharply distinguished from a statement, which is a long propositional set of utterances, which only he has the right to make. That's the basic rule. And there's one of these questions per customer, not two, not three, not four, piggybacked on top of one. There you go. Fire away.
Brilliantly put. I think people have wanted to say that for a long time. You got it.
Okay, you began your speech by emphasizing that Iraq had been a fairly developed society with a substantial middle class, and that over the last 20 years, perhaps, they were de-developing, and obviously it's been a disaster recently. But that sounds more like, as you pointed out, a restoration problem than a development problem, and I was looking for analogs to the situation, and the obvious ones that come to mind are Japan and Germany after World War II. And that obviously went well, since 20 years later, they were serious competitors to the United States. What makes this problem more difficult, or how is it different?
Well, I guess there's a basic difference. Number one, Germany and Japan had fought a specific war which they lost, and they were devastated. Their de-development, in a sense, wasn't something which was protracted and extended over decades. In fact, they were developing very rapidly, particularly Japan, so that within a very short space of time after the Meiji Restoration, they were able to take on Russia, and then, of course, they had a constitutional phase, but the militaries took over, and they were able to take on the West, or so they thought, and then this devastation was visited upon them, although they had developed a kind of industrial culture that went with that kind of development before. Iraq compared well with the region. You know, its social indices were better. Now, a lot of that was due to oil, no doubt about it, which was invested in social and human infrastructure. But it didn't have an industrial culture. It didn't have the kind of habits which were already there, dispersed, and need now to be recollected. So it doesn't start in that advantageous position. B, while it has developed a dependency syndrome because of the power of the center of the Iraq doesn't have the attitudes or the psychology of a country that has been military defeated. It doesn't have the sense of having declared war on America and then, having lost that war, signed a sort of peace treaty in which they've sort of given up all rights because they started off, and did something nasty and are paying for that. No, they've been through an experience. There was a dictator. Series of events happened. That dictator regime has been removed. A lot of people have all kinds of attitudes towards that, without in any way putting in a good word for the previous ruler. They have a number of attitudes towards the events that led up to that. So they're not analogous in that sense to the case of Japan or Germany. And I think the de-development that has taken place, that was a smashing of the existing state of the economy, which then reconstituted itself fairly quickly. In Iraq, there was a certain level, not anywhere close to what Germany and Japan had arrived at, but nonetheless, given by regional standards, it was in some respects fairly impressive, some of the social indices. And from that period, they have been regressing, and the per capita income today, I don't have the exact figures, and I know it's very difficult to get exact figures because you can't do those kinds of surveys easily in Iraq, but the per capita income today of Iraq probably compares unfavorably with what it was 20 years ago. So.
Let's go to that, Mike. I don't know, everybody, the people, now we have a distribution problem. I saw you first, but you were there, right? You were there first. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure. Sure.
Right.
Why not?
If you don't mind, if you can stand by.
Sure.
I'm doing justice to microphones. Why should we care about justice to microphones? But I'm going to go up there. Quick question from up here.
Last year at the Women Waging Peace Conference, there was a couple women from Iraq who came, including one with the surname Talabani. I'm not sure if there's any relation to the new leader, but they had pointed out that women were actually doing a lot of things at various levels. And so I wanted to find out from you what the UN is doing to find out what women are doing in terms of redevelopment and building bonds between different communities. So what are you doing, and how's that going?
Well, I mean, we have this cluster approach, and we have 11 clusters which deal with various aspects of the reconstruction and humanitarian process. And I forget which cluster it is. 9 is for governance, which includes, also women's empowerment. And that has been working with through the ministries in Iraq for, setting the tone or having seminars and raising consciousness. And the women of Iraq are fairly active. I think out of 275, this was a pretty healthy sort of rule that they had established. Every third person on every list had to be a lady, and every fourth member of the TNA, the Transitional National Assembly, is a lady there. So there are, I think, something like almost 80 women in Parliament now. But Parliament is, I know, women's presence in Parliament is itself not an indicator of gender, balance or balance of opportunities. But these things have also been affected by security and the general environment. But in our own approach, we are emphasizing this aspect particularly because this is one of the criteria that we keep in mind, when assisting any of these countries. I don't have specific figures as which could suggest improvements in the 2 years that we've been there, and I don't think there would be too much to say, except that the planning is there. Lots of workshops and meetings with women's groups are taking place, and I've met with them too. And one is very pleased to see that they are active, they are aware, and I think in the constitution-making process you will see women's groups very active on many issues, not only with respect to gender rights, but also with respect to maybe issues such as the role of religion in state, which impacts also on such issues. I think they're gearing themselves up, readying themselves, and in our assistance to the constitution-making process, we will be coordinating assistance from maybe quarters which would like to sort of enable and empower such groups to sort of, be heard within the constitutional process.
Can I just ask a supplemental for this excellent question? What could or what should the UN do if the constitutional process that you're gearing towards in August eviscerates these 1/3 participation rules and begins to send women back? Is there anything that the UN can do in a situation where the gender achievements under this transitional administration get shut down by the constitutional process itself? I mean, if they're a third of the women are there, they're going to fight. But is there anything the UN can do, or is that interference in the constitutional affairs of?
I think that's a very good question, and it does sort of bring us to that question. I think what we really can do there is to sort of say, refer to best practices, refer to the experience of other countries, maybe in the region which have sort of, similar cultures or similar circumstances, or beyond in the developing world, Latin America or Africa, and suggest to them how to sort of resolve these issues. Those who might think in terms of eviscerating these procedures, why would they want to do it? All right, if it's their interpretation of, say, the requirements of religion, if that's what your question might sort of refer to as a possibility, we can also see from the experience of other countries, have they all gone down that path? And those that haven't gone down that path, many of them can sort of study that and see whether their requirements can be met without undermining rights and rules. So it'll be an enabling, informing process. We will not seek to say, you must do this, otherwise you're not fulfilling our criteria. I think the one criteria we will insist upon, which does touch upon this, is that any constitution should conform to recognize international norms of human rights and things like that. Those it should be, that should not be violative of human rights or norms that are internationally recognized and are embodied in conventions and treaties. That is something we can, along with the international community, insist upon. But specific modalities to resolve specific issues, we would like that to come out of the process of discussion.
Thank you. My name is Karen Hirschfeld. I was just curious, directly after the elections, when it became clear that there was very low Sunni participation, whether that was out of fear of violence or intentional as a boycott, there was a lot of talk about the Kurds and the Shias reaching out to the Sunnis in terms of participation, and it sounded like it was a very proactive measure. And I'm wondering, from your vantage point on the inside of this very political process, is there a sense that the Sunnis are now anxious to be a part of the constitutional forming assembly or process, or is it still a sense that the Shias and the Kurds are trying to encourage their participation? Thank you.
That's a very good question. First, with regard to Sunni participation or non-participation in the electoral process, how much of it was due to intimidation, how much of it was due to alienation, or how much of it? I think the easy answer is to suggest it was a mix of both. In some areas, the intimidation factor was considerable, but there were areas for sure where the alienation factor was also at play, and there also were a mix in the sense that people may have wanted to vote but weren't too sure because of administrative arrangements. There were changes in the location of polling booths and things of that sort, and sometimes they stayed away not because they didn't wish to brave the security threat, but because those were the minority. Basically, it's a mix between those two, and I wouldn't want to say how much, but I think it's significant that the leadership of the Kurdish Alliance and of the Shia coalition took note of the fact that the Sunnis had, in general, turned out in very low numbers, and didn't sort of seek to legitimate it or delegitimate it with reference to intimidation or alienation. They thought it was absolutely imperative to bring them into the political process if the political process was going to be inclusive and stable and lead to anything, productive or, in terms of the goals. So they have done that. They have brought the Sunnis. You have now, the Speaker of the Parliament did stand for the election and got into Parliament, and the Vice President also is who was the President up until now. He has, but many of the ministerial posts which have not yet been announced are most likely going to be filled by Sunnis who did not participate in the elections, are coming in from outside. And that is because they negotiated with the other groups, and they agreed that, yes, you get together, the Sunni groups, you decide upon a list, we will consider that list, and on that basis, I don't know the exact outcome, which ministry is going to whom, but we do know there will be reasonable Sunni participation in the government, and modalities are being established to encourage Sunni participation in the constitution-making process, although they won't be in Parliament, but they could become associated with or members of a constitutional committee, which would have responsibilities in that.
I'm going to go up here for that next question, and then here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Josh Potashnik. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College. I have a question about the political institutions that are being developed in Iraq. It seems like there are kind of two primary ways you can guarantee the rights of minorities in a country like Iraq. Either you can have national guarantees written into the Constitution at the national level, or you can have a lot of federalism. And I was wondering, in your opinion, is it better in Iraq to have guarantees written into the national constitution, specifically laying out the rights of each of the three major groups, or is it better to have, federalism where a lot of power is devolved onto regional areas?
Well, you can have both, can't you? You can have a federal structure, and it's always good for a national constitution to delineate or to enumerate rights, whether you do it in the shape of a Bill of Rights or you do it in the shape of an article which mentions rights, and rights which are recognized throughout the world. And minority rights are usually are very high in any such list. So, and if you look at the text of the interim constitution, rights are also sort of announced there, are written there. Now, they may debate the exact wording or, or the manner in which those rights are described, but it's my feeling that there would definitely, the Constitution almost certainly will spell out those rights and will sort of guarantee those rights. That is an essential part of a modern Constitution. How they do it, they will sort of discuss that amongst themselves. And they will also, the structure of the state, whether it's going to be federal, unitary, or whatever else they decide upon, that's also going to be decided. Nothing is a given, and nobody can sort of, we might sort of sit back and assume that, well, it's more likely to be this than the other and all. But the manner in which they enshrine these rights or guarantee these rights, I believe it would be quite reasonable to expect that they will be mentioned in the Constitution that they will write.
Let's go over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Henry Hammond. I'm a retired lawyer and an amateur student of international relations. I'd be curious to know about the agency which I assume you head. In other words, you're not obviously doing this alone. I assume you have an office. I'd be curious to know where the office or offices are located and how many people you have and where they come from and what's your budget and do you have a sufficient budget?
We have, the office is called UNAMI, United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq. And we have offices inside Iraq in Baghdad, and we're in the process of opening up other offices in Basra in the south and Erbil in the north. And outside of Iraq, we have offices in Amman, in Jordan, and in Kuwait, which provides logistical support, as well as coverage of the lower south area of Iraq. And then, of course, we have headquarters support from New York. And our numbers inside Iraq are relatively limited by the security situation. Nonetheless, they have increased despite the fact that the security situation hasn't shown a breakthrough. But when I arrived there, the total number of the staff in Baghdad was 35. Today there are over 200, but that includes the security component, a large security component. Even so, the support and substantive staff has more than doubled and will continue to increase, circumstances permitting, always that caveat. And outside in Amman, we have a larger number, a much larger number, because the security situation there is much more normal.
We have time for 2 more questions, and one of them is right there.
Hi, my name is Mona Mouafi. I'm a doctoral student at the Harvard School of Public Health. My question is with regards to the role of Sistani and religion in the writing of the Constitution. Sistani played an important role in sort of guiding, containing, I guess, the violence through what could have been a much more difficult situation throughout the conflict. And I'm curious as to what the nature of the relationship is right now between the United Nations and Sistani, and what the role of the different, or what the ideas people are bringing into the table from the different groups with regards to the role of religion in writing the Constitution.
Good question. Relations between United Nations and Sistani are very good, and I think the proof or the manifestation of it is that I was able to travel to Najaf recently and to meet with him for well over an hour and to discuss a range of issues with him. It's true that he's a spiritual leader. He's a man of religion, and he's quite explicit on the subject, saying that he doesn't like to get involved in politics, except when he sees a general danger, let's say, in confronting the people of Iraq. Then he would sort of pronounce upon it and try to sort of give some sort of guidance, as it were. But other than that, he doesn't get into the nitty-gritty, of drawing up party platforms or deciding upon who will get what post. His critics in Iraq might not be entirely convinced of that and would allege, and indeed some prominent politicians and leaders have already suggested that he's more active than he admits to. But his influence has most certainly been one for moderation. And even in very trying moments where, people have been killed in large numbers as a result of outrages, and there has been, a tendency amongst hotheads to retaliate against whomever they thought might be responsible or connected with communities that they thought might be responsible, and have sought to get a green light from Sistani. He's been very emphatic on that and said, absolutely, you will, no matter what has happened, that would be the very worst thing to do. And he's been very consistent there, very emphatic. He's also, when it came to the question of elections, he wanted the elections to be held earlier, for instance, and all. He encouraged the people of Iraq to participate in the elections. And I think he, as far as government formation is concerned, he didn't concern himself with the nitty-gritty, but I think he did indicate that this process ought to sort of, be concluded, within a reasonable period of time. So those kinds of interventions he has been known to make, not get involved in as I said, the details. He does. He was quite clear. He does expect the UN to play a assisting and facilitating and a role to enable the transition process, but doesn't get into detailed discussions on these matters. He is basically a man of religion, a spiritual figure who's prefers to stay as far as is possible away from politics, but it's drawn by his sense of obligation into commenting from time to time on issues.
Last question from this mic.
Hi, my name is Ali Sayed. I am a student at the Kennedy School. My question is concerns is about the broader role of the UN. I must commend the great services that the UN is providing, everywhere in Iraq and generally in the world. But what I see, these are mostly like administrative services. In my opinion, I see UN as its role would come about much earlier than the election process. It should have been there. If all of a sudden some government decides to liberate people from a dictator who does not have weapons of mass destruction, maybe that is where the UN needs to give a mandate, for some it's crisis resolution. It's where the critical role of UN comes into, and I don't think personally, I don't believe UN has really performed its duties really well there. So do you think, what's your opinion, if such a crisis comes out in the future, would the UN, is it doing good? Would it be able to perform its most critical function properly or not?
Very apt and appropriate question, and I think the best answer to this is to try and draw a distinction between the United Nations Secretariat and the United Nations Security Council. The Secretariat gets its marching orders, as it were, from the Security Council. And the Security Council debates issues and, and drafts resolutions and sort of amends them, adopts them, rejects them. And there's a dynamic that sort of comes into play there, a dynamic that is a very broad dynamic and sort of comes to culmination within the chambers of the Security Council. But from there flows the framework within which the Secretariat and the UN Secretary General is expected to perform. So if you feel there's a time which is very appropriate for the UN to intervene, to either bring about or prevent the development of a situation, the UN will not be able to respond unless it has a Security Council resolution mandating it to do very specific jobs. And if the dynamics within that council are such that no such resolution is forthcoming, the UN can still sort of play there are many policy tools available to it, but it will not have a mandate to sort of systematically sort of send a mission or be somewhere or play a facilitating role in terms of peacekeeping or peace building or political transitions. Those must always flow from specific resolutions over which the Secretariat itself doesn't have control. Those are debated amongst the members of the Security Council, and so I think that is in some ways your question is, of course, well addressed to the entire complex of the UN, but when it's addressed, say, to a mission like UNAMI, then it needs to take into account this distinction between the Security Council and the Secretariat.
Let me just draw this to a close with three brief remarks. One, that you can't have development without security, obvious. You can't have security without development. Those points came through very clearly. The second point is that notice how frequently the word facilitation occurred in the ambassador's talk. There are a whole variety of ways in which the UN can be involved in the reconstruction of countries. And they range from the vice-regal and the crypto-imperial to the facilitative and diplomatic. And this seems to be on the diplomatic facilitative end. It's an extremely delicate role. You shouldn't come out of the afternoon thinking that the UN is writing the constitution for Iraq, that the UN is driving the political process. It's nudging, suggesting, talking, facilitating. Good offices, do you need some advice, do you need some help, that kind of stuff. Very, very different from the roles that it's had in other countries. And to do that role, you have to have a person who is a very, very skilled diplomat. So that's why they went to this guy. The other reason and this is my final comment, the other reason, let us not forget that this man has to wear body armor and has to travel in an armored vehicle. So you are looking at a skilled diplomat, and you're also looking at a very courageous one. So I'd like us to give him a big warm hand of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is a reception at MIT Museum on Mass Avenue. It says 7 p.m. on the program, but it is actually at 6 p.m. We hope to see you all there. It's again at MIT Museum on Mass Avenue. Thank you.